Well, we're picking up where we left off on the Big Canyon.
Oh boy.
What a project.
I'll say.
So we've more or less finished the Big Trestle, but we can't put it together yet because, well, there needs to be a canyon here.
A canyon?
We've got scenery to do, and we've done some of the scenery here at the bottom of the canyon, and of course the mine, which we've already covered. And now what we need to do is, this is kind of unusual, we need to move to the top part of the canyon because the big holdup here has been that the mirror has been missing. And that was intimidating.
Yeah, just a little bit. Just watching them put that in place. Oh my.
Yeah, people were saying, why don't you put it in yourself? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So it's a rather huge mirror, and we couldn't work on the top part of the canyon until the mirror was in, and we can't work on the middle part of the canyon until the top part of the canyon is in. So, as they would say, this has been the tall tent pole. This has been holding up the show. Hopefully that greases right in there.
Yeah, you can drill through the starbolt too.
And so now with the mirror in, we can continue the logging railroad where it comes into the canyon.
That's going to be neat.
Because we've already built the logging railroad a year ago, but we had to stop here because we need the backdrop and the mirror, and now we're able to continue scenery and continue laying track. So this has been sort of the plan. We started with the scenery building at the bottom, and then we're now moving to the top, and we can build the top of the canyon and the bottom of the canyon, and now I just want to build in between the two and fill in the middle.
I was just going to say, they're going to meet in the middle somewhere, I hope.
And then we can drive a golden spike. This is sort of like the way they built the Transcontinental Railroad.
Oh boy.
Start at both ends.
There you go.
And meet in the middle. Now, a year ago when we were working on the logging railroad, and here's a link to the videos on building the logging railroad, we made the decision to use rough-hewn sticks and some old failed ties and stuff, the sort of thing that a logging railroad would actually be cobbled together out of.
Well, they are actually pencils.
Some of them are pencils, some of them are sticks out of the yard, and some of them are ties that I used somewhere else and ripped up and thought, you know, those look so distressed, I want to use them somewhere else.
Man.
So the first thing to do was cut them all to the proper length, and I sort of used the existing failed ties as a guide, saying this is approximately how long they're going to be, but I don't want them to be the same length because I want it to really look rough.
And it does.
And it does. So once I got the ties all figured out, and I needed to figure out how many, so I was just sort of setting them in place here on the extruded styrene and getting some idea of the proper spacing and that sort of thing to figure out how many of these things we need to cut out. Now, as Karen was saying, some of these are pencils that we found in novelty shops.
Yeah, she's the right stuff.
and they're just these weird pencils that are made out of sticks, and they're just an oddball novelty. And on some of them, there's just a little bit of lead at the end, but then, and so when I cut them off, it's no big deal. But on some of them, the pencil lead went all the way up through to the other end.
So you got to get the lead out.
Absolutely. So the next thing is to use the belt sander here, the tabletop belt sander, and flatten the bottom and the top.
Oh.
Because they've got to function as railroad ties, and that means they've got to be an even thickness. They all have to have the same thickness, and then they have to be flat on the top and bottom. And then I don't want to simply glue them to the insulation board here. They won't stay down. So what I've done on the rest of the railroad is cut out thin plywood and then glue that to the foam, and then that way I've got a really solid backing to glue my ties to.
Wow.
And then there's a little bit of edge and buckling, and I need to make sure that the seams are smooth and that everything is nice and flat and regular before gluing the ties on. So I got the other belt sander, the handheld belt sander, and just ran that back and forth across the roadbed to make sure it was nice and flat. Now for the next step of sanding down the ties, I had to take the whole thing outside and open the garage door because boy does this make a mess.
Oh, that belt sander, yes, it throws it.
it throws it everywhere. And then start to figure out how thick to make them. And as you can see, a flat bottom and a flat top so that the rails will sit neatly on here and they can be spiked in place. Same thing, actually, that the railroads did when they were using logs for ties.
Well, it makes sense. It's a logging railroad. Use what's handy.
Yeah. Pragmatic engineering.
It works for me.
Then a bit of tight bond yellow glue to glue these things in place. Again, trying to figure out the proper tie spacing. I used a really wide tie spacing and then later on thought, they're too far apart, so I moved them closer together.
Okay.
And then coming back with just this metal miter box looking for high spots. And there's one right there, and there's a little one right there. Because it all has to be flat, so the rail sits flat on it.
So what happens if you find a low spot? Call the road department? That would be a pothole.
That would be a pothole. Well, fortunately, I was just bringing them from the top down and the top down and the top down and trying to get it to the point where everything was nice and flat. And then once I was within range of where I wanted to be, back to the handheld sander here and knock down any of the really noticeable high spots. And then just constantly keep checking with my little flat piece of metal here. And I kept finding the odd high spot and then come back with the sander until I finally got it to where everything was, for the most part, smooth and flat across the top.
So when they did that, on the logging railroad, did they run up and down with a miter box? A big one? I mean, I want to see the size of that belt sander.
Yeah, that would. They must have had some system in place. I think the system in place was just run the train down it, and if it derails, pull that tie out and throw it away.
I guess if the train tips over, whoops.
And then I lifted this section up to where the logging railroad is. So this track is 8 feet above the floor.
Yes.
And the section that I'm working on, all of these sections are removable for maintenance purposes. And so I was able to lift this up in place and then bring it down. But I needed to check the alignment with the existing railroad to make sure that the rails would line up. And then it has to tie into the mirror at the other end so that it looks like the logging railroad just continues on off into the distance.
Right. So when you put a train on there, is that where the golden spike is going to go?
Yeah, I guess so.
They'll be meeting right there.
Right there, head to head. But the view into the mirror, I think, is critical. Because this is part of the look right here, is seeing the reflection in the mirror.
It's seriously really cool.
It really is.
Oh, man.
And then I had to carve a little bit of hill because the hill on the logging railroad just runs out. And that too has to continue across the seam right here. So I had to carve a little bit of a hill here for a continuation of the existing hill.
Right.
Now we're ready to start laying the track. The problem is, I don't have any rail.
What?
Well, I used it all up, and I had a couple little pieces just to check alignment with, but we had to order some new rail. What we've been using is Llagas Creek rail on the entire railroad. We had a bunch of different types of rail at one time, and we've gotten rid of all of that and switched completely over to using Llagas Creek rail. The reason we wanted all of the rail to be of the same manufacturer is that there are subtle differences between the brands of rail, and a lot of the rail that we had before was a real heavy aluminum rail, and boy, I didn't care for the look of it at all. So we've just switched everything over to using Llagas Creek. That way all of the profiles of the rail match and we don't run into problems with things not lining up. But the biggest reason, I think, is that different rails, because they have a different profile and a different shape, they'll only work with the plastic tie strips that particular company makes. So if you want to use plastic tie strips anywhere on your railroad, you want to make sure that the rail and the tie strips are by the same manufacturer. And so we simply decided we're just going to go completely with Llagas Creek, in large part because I really like the look of their plastic tie strips, and that's what we're planning to use outdoors. Their customer service is also, to say first rate would be an understatement. Mike over there is always available to answer questions. They get your orders right straight off. Everything is just great. So that's why we've gone exclusively with Llagas Creek. Now we're using two different sizes of rail. On the logging railroad, we're using code 215. On the main line, we're using 250. And what is meant by code, I know some people get this confused, but code simply means the height of the rail. From the base of the rail to the top of the rail is 215 thousandths of an inch.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's all that number is, the height of the rail in thousandths of an inch. There is one problem when dealing with code 215, and that's that nobody makes a rail joiner for code 215.
Oh dear.
And there's all these suggestions of how to go about that. I took Micro Engineering's code 250 rail joiners and then took a file to them and just file them down till they fit on the code 215 rail.
Well, there you go.
Takes a little while, but it's not all that tough to do. I'm also painting the rail with just a primer paint to give it that rusty brown appearance, and then take a cloth with lacquer thinner and wipe off the bottom and the top.
Oh.
For conductivity, I want conductivity on the bottom too, because my rail joiners, while I don't count on them to conduct the electricity across the gap, I like to think that they will anyway.
Exactly.
So I'll clean off both the top and the bottom of the rail with a lacquer thinner after I've shot it with paint. And then one last check on high spots. Now that I've actually got my rail that I can set in place, I want to make sure that I've got, for the most part, good contact between the rail and the ties. You can see there is a low spot right there.
Yep, I can.
And that's okay. Well, you know, it'll work anyway. Now here's a thing that Steve and Don and myself and Al, it's just something that we took to doing years and years ago, and that's solder a set of leads to every single rail.
That makes sense.
Because if you count on the rail joiners to conduct your electricity, eventually one of them's going to get dirty or something's going to go wrong, and then your rail stops conducting. So every single rail is connected to power. Now I started spiking the rail here where it ties into the other railroad because the rail lengths have to line up with the existing rail lengths, and because the track crosses it at an angle, those joints are staggered.
Oh.
And so I just set everything in place and then put my rail joiners and my rails in place, and then that way I know that my new track lines up perfectly with my old track.
Well, that's neat.
And then I was able to lift the section down and finish spiking here at the workbench.
Which is safer.
Which is a lot safer than, being on the top of a ladder.
Yeah.
And then I'm pre-drilling every single hole, because where the red cedar ties here, I could easily push a tie into. As soon as it hits that plywood, it comes to a stop.
Oh.
So, and then the sticks, there's no way I could push a spike into those. So I just made a habit of pre-drilling every single hole for the spikes. I'm using two different track gauges as I go along. This is a Llagas Creek gauge, and then that plastic gauge behind there is a Micro Engineering. I like the Micro Engineerings because they snap in place and hold everything in alignment while I'm working. but in the area where I'm actually spiking, I use the Llagas Creek. I like the triangular shape of that. It actually expands the gauge ever so slightly as you're going through curves.
Oh, neat.
Now, people working in smaller scales tend to spike just every 5th tie, 3rd tie, whatever. In this kind of size, you really need to spike every single tie to the rail, because it just shows. If there's a missing spike there, it just looks wrong. And then the spikes are shoved into place using spiking pliers. Got these from Walthers. And it allows you to just push the spike right straight in there, and you want to make sure it's nice and straight and all the way down to the bottom of the rail, because it's very easy to mess up and not get them all the way in, and then later on when the train comes by, the flange hits the spike.
Oh.
There's a little bit of an issue here where the two sections join together, and that's that there isn't enough room to slide the rail joiner back. So what I decided to do is have a couple of the spikes that I can pull up, slide the rail joiner in, get the rail joiner in place, and then put the spikes back in place.
There you go.
Anyway, there it is, all ready for ballast and scenery.
Yes.
But before I get into something like that, I want to carve the foam.
Oh.
And that means carving the whole rest of the canyon.
Exactly.
Everything needs to be done in the proper order, a good proper workflow.
Exactly.
I'm going to be using some filler materials on here, and then of course painting everything. But I'm trying a technique I haven't used before, and that's carving the rock pattern directly into the foam.
Oh.
And I got this from Dave at Thunder Mesa Studio.
Right. He does some really good work.
Oh man, I'll tell you what. And I've been following his channel for a couple of years, and that's how he does his layout. He just carves the stonework directly into the foam. And so I've been studying those videos, and I'm going to try carving the canyon using his technique.
I think that'll work.
I hope so.
Yes, for
All
sure.
depends on if I can figure it out. But there it is right there. That's kind of the look that we're after.
Right.
And then without a whole lot of filling or anything, just put paint directly over this, and it should look pretty good.
Should look great.
It involves using the hot wire cutter and then coming back with a wire brush to carve in the stratification into the stonework. And I think I've pretty much figured out his technique.
Exactly. If it wasn't purple, you could leave it just like it is.
Yeah, the color's a little off.
Yeah.
If this was, they'd make it a national park if it was for real. Oh, Purple Canyon
Song
National
or something.
Park.
Yeah, purple mountains. Are you going to have a fruited plain?
That's the next thing. Anyway, these cliffs are a full 12 feet tall, so it should be pretty spectacular once it's all done.
I think so.
But that's also going to have to be a future video.
Right.
I think we've arrived at an end point here, and we'll pick it up from the 10-foot to the 12-foot section here on the cliff.
Literally picking it up, yes.
And Steve is building us this great windmill, and that's going to go up into the canyon scene.
Oh, fun.
It's going to be a very crowded scene, vertically speaking. Mm-hmm. But that should be really fun. He's building this thing entirely from scratch out of brass. And
oh my gosh.
typical Steve.
Yeah.
It's like, what?
What?
It's brilliant.
Yes.
Anyway, there it is, the project so far.
So far.
So far. So you want to make sure that you can follow along with all of this. So if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe.
Absolutely.
And the easy way to subscribe is by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Are we ready for that? Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet, and we hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here on Tuesday.
Absolutely.
See you then.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.